Hi, this is Bob Wright of The Wright Show, and I just wanted to say that the conversation you're about to hear is unusual for us because it's not a conversation. It's just me talking, at least until the question and answer session. This is a talk I gave at Union Theological Seminary in New York City a couple of weeks ago on the subject of mindful resistance. Now, mindful resistance, in addition to being a thing that I describe in this talk, is the name of a newsletter that I put out in collaboration with some people who helped me put it out. It comes out every week. You can get it for free by going to mindfulresistance.net and filling in your email address. And then if you get super enthusiastic about it and want to send large sums of money in its direction, there's a Patreon page for the Mindful Resistance newsletter as well. As long as I'm in self-promotion mode, I might as well say something that I basically never say, which is that if you want to support the Wright Show podcast, or for that matter, any other shows that are on Blogging Heads TV or Meaning of Life TV, which are these two things that I run and that the Wright Show is part of, you should do what podcast hosts are always saying you should do, which, if I recall correctly, is like go to iTunes and like us and rate us. Is that the terminology? Anyway, if it is, then do it. Unless, of course, you would give us a low rating, in which case you should not go to iTunes. But in any event, thank you for listening this far. I hope you'll listen further and see what you think of this mindful resistance concept if you're not already familiar with it, and see if you want to subscribe to the newsletter if you're not already doing that. I hope you like the talk. Thanks.
Well, hello. Can you hear me? Can you hear me too much? Is it too loud? Just right? Okay. Well, I'm Robert Wright, visiting professor of science and spirituality here at Union Theological Seminary. Thanks very much for coming tonight in spite of this kind of iffy weather. For those of you who don't know much about me, let me say just a little bit in the way of introduction. I've written, I guess, a few books that have some relevance to what I'm going to be talking about tonight. One is called The Moral Animal. One is called Nonzero. One is called The Evolution of God. And the most recent and most relevant is a book called Why Buddhism is True. Now, my own view is that the book Why Buddhism is True is not as obnoxious as the title may sound. The title does have a kind of, I'm right and you're wrong, and if you were smart enough, you'd know it, quality to it. So I want to emphasize, especially since I am here in a non-Buddhist house of worship, that the claims I defend in the book are not claims that are at odds with any core beliefs of any other religions. I don't really get into the religious parts of Buddhism, deities, realms of hell, rebirth, and so on. It's a defense of the core claims in kind of Buddhist philosophy and Buddhist psychology, and I'll be getting into some of those tonight. Now, the other publication that I'm associated with that's relevant to what I'm talking about tonight is the Mindful Resistance newsletter, weekly newsletter, delivered via email. I would be chastised by the people who helped me put it out if I did not take the time to tell you that you can sign up for it at mindfulresistance.net. There's also a sign-up sheet back there if you want to put your email address in. Now, tonight I'm going to talk about mindful resistance, what it means, how it's relevant to the pretty disturbing time we're living in, and how it will be relevant after Donald Trump, one big source of disturbance, has passed from the political scene. And I do think that the kind of work that mindful resistance involves will need to be done after Trump has passed from the scene. And in fact, I think more of it should have been done before he showed up. And in fact, maybe if enough of it had been done, he wouldn't have shown up at all, which would have been okay with me. Now, I've used the word work here, and mindful resistance does involve a kind of work, but I want to emphasize that there are personal benefits that can be derived from it. It can involve some measure of equanimity, getting some peace of mind, and in fact, nurturing equanimity is part of the process by which I think mindful resistance can have a positive impact on the world. So the premise here is that, helping yourself and helping the world can go hand in hand. And of course, people have said this before. There are a lot of versions of it. For example, the Dalai Lama has said, world peace can only be based on inner peace. Now, there are people who are dismissive of these kinds of claims, who dismiss them as, kind of naive cliches. But tonight, I will be defending some things that might be considered naive cliches, such as, you shouldn't hate your enemies. Maybe you should even consider loving your enemies. Now, some of you may be wondering, am I now going to suggest that you consider loving Donald Trump? The answer is not right now, because I don't want to trigger a rush for the exits. I'll leave you in suspense as to whether I'm going to do it later. So as you probably have gathered, the term mindful resistance is inspired by the term the resistance. Of course, after Trump was elected, some people who opposed him started calling themselves the resistance. There is, of course, no official office of the resistance, no official views of the resistance. So when I attribute views and attitudes and tendencies to the resistance, I'm speaking loosely, but I do think there are some kind of identifiable tendencies and narratives associated with the resistance. Now, the obvious question is, what's the difference between mindful resistance and the regular resistance? Well, one difference is the word mindful. I'll get to that. But first, I want to just kind of telegraphically convey a couple of kind of differences of attitude about what the current moment represents and how we should approach it. One distinction, one kind of bedrock principle of the mindful resistance is something that I alluded to when I said there would be more work to be done after Trump is gone, okay? Because I think that although Trump himself is a problem, he's also a symptom of a deeper problem, okay? And that the problem is going to be with us long after he's gone, because it's a very stubborn problem. I think in the kind of regular resistance, there's this idea that, well, if we can just get rid of Trump, then things will return to normal and everything will be okay. Well, I mean, for one thing, I didn't think normal was all that great, personally, before he showed up. So the restoration of normalcy will not fulfill all my wildest hopes and dreams. But more to the point, I think a lot of people who voted for Trump, they were not happy with normal. And in fact, that's why they voted for Trump. That's why Trump is here, because they weren't happy with normal. Now, they may have differing ideas from mine as to what exactly was wrong with normal, but I still think it's very much worth figuring out what their objection was to the way things were, getting a clear read on that, what gave rise to their discontent, what conditions gave rise to their discontent, so that maybe we can change some of the conditions and make people like Trump less likely to show up in the future. Now, obviously, this doesn't mean you do whatever it takes to please Trump supporters. So if they say, the problem with America before Trump was that we just weren't separating enough families at the border, obviously, we're going to say, well, we can't help you there. But I still do think that just as an initial phase of the inquiry, it's important to do the hard work of figuring out what motivated support for Trump. I'm a big believer in what's called cognitive empathy. That's not to be confused with the more commonly discussed kind of empathy, emotional empathy. Emotional empathy is like identifying with the emotions of people, feeling their pain. Cognitive empathy is just about understanding their perspective, okay? perspective taking, how the world looks to them. It doesn't presuppose that you feel their pain or even that you care about them. It's just an exercise in comprehension, and I'm a big believer in trying to understand the perspective of all the players in the world, all the players in the political scene, Putin, everyone. I think it can only help. Now, there's another important distinction between mindful resistance and kind of the regular resistance. It has to do with the nature of engagement with kind of Trump and news about Trump. I think there's a tendency in the resistance, and among a lot of people, and sometimes me, it's a very natural thing, but to be kind of obsessively reactive to the news about Trump. You know, what's the latest outrageous thing he said? You marvel at how outrageous it is. You talk about it on social media. You condemn it, and so on. Perfectly natural thing to do, but it has some downsides. One is that it can distract you. It can keep you from thinking about what the real underlying problem is. It takes time to be obsessively reactive 24/7. Another thing it can distract you from are the more dangerous things Trump is doing. It's easy to get so wrapped up in the thing that drives you craziest that he's done this week as to lose sight of what may be in the long run the most pernicious. So, for example, it's been clear for a long time that John Bolton, National Security Advisor, if he has his way, will move us in the direction of military confrontation with Iran. In the last few days, we've seen that become more apparent. Well, I'm proud to say that in the newsletter, we've been highlighting this for some time. So too with America's, in my view, shameful involvement and support of the Saudi military intervention in Yemen. That finally came to light when the killing of Jamal Khashoggi kind of cast a spotlight on Saudi Arabia's kind of dubious behavior in the region generally, and it became a big issue. Again, I'm proud to say we had talked about it a number of times in the newsletter before. So one thing we try to do in the newsletter is, in our summary of the week, bring attention to things we think aren't getting enough attention, and often just not even mention the things that are getting plenty of attention, at least as much as, in our view, they deserve. Now, the other problem with being obsessively reactive to Trump is it can actually help him politically in the short run. If you respond to news about him and things he says too unreflectively, it can actually strengthen him politically. And I'll give you an example of that in a second, actually in a few minutes. But first I want to back up and talk about mindfulness, because it is the basic framework here. It is the frame of mind we try to cultivate to kind of do the work of mindful resistance as effectively as possible. Now, you probably have varying degrees of familiarity with mindfulness and have heard different things about it. So, for example, some of you may have encountered it in a strictly therapeutic context, say mindfulness-based stress reduction. So you may associate mindfulness with just trying to kind of calm down. And that's a valid association. Mindfulness meditation can make you calmer, and that can come in handy. But I want to emphasize, this is not a calm that comes through kind of insulation from reality. So morphine can make you calm, but it does that by making you numb to reality. And the kind of calm you would cultivate through mindfulness is not a kind of a numb calm. It's an equanimity that is consistent with engagement with the world. Now, another thing you may have heard about mindfulness, you may associate the phrase living in the moment, and that's often taken to mean, kind of savoring the things that are to be savored, savoring the food, the appreciating the beauty in small things. And that's perfectly fine. I'm not against it. I try to do it sometimes. But, excuse me, just as we're not seeking a calm that involves a kind of numbness and insulation, we wouldn't want a version of living in the moment that kind of distracts us from the political moment, okay? That is a means of escape from it. The idea isn't, well, sure, Trump is destroying the world, but, check out that great avocado toast or whatever it is that you're savoring at the moment. We're not on board for that. As we'll see in a second, that wouldn't even be true mindfulness in the Buddhist sense of the word. It certainly wouldn't be mindful resistance, because mindful resistance is about engaging with the political moment in the most constructive way possible, both in the short term and in the long term. Now, if you want to know more about mindfulness in the Buddhist sense of the term, a good place to look is a text called the Satipatthana Sutta. That's kind of the closest thing there is to a Bible of mindfulness in ancient Buddhist texts. The sati part is the word that is translated as mindfulness. Satipatthana is usually rendered as, the Satipatthana Sutta is generally rendered as the four foundations of mindfulness. That's not quite the literal meaning, but that's the term in English. So, as far as what it says, well, first of all, the sutra doesn't say this is about calming down. There's no explicit guidance of that sort. It doesn't say this is about living in the moment. In fact, there's not a single word in the text that can be translated as moment or now. Now, to be sure, authentic, genuine mindfulness will tend to draw you into the moment. It will tend to bring calm. That's fine. But that's not the purpose of mindfulness according to this ancient Buddhist text. The purpose of mindfulness is to attain enlightenment. That's what the text says at the end. The point is if you diligently pursue mindfulness, you will attain enlightenment. Now, of course, this is enlightenment in the Buddhist sense, not in the Western sense. And in the Buddhist sense, enlightenment, has a lot of dimensions, and it's kind of the culmination of the Buddhist path for those who manage to actually get there. But there is some overlap between the kind of Western meaning of enlightenment and the Buddhist meaning. And I would say the overlap is that with both of them, there's a strong connotation of just seeing the world clearly. Okay, just seeing the world clearly. That may sound like a pretty prosaic thing to be associated with something as exotic as Buddhist enlightenment is thought to be, but remember, the kind of core promise of Buddhism, in my view, is that, the reason we suffer and the reason we make other people suffer is that we just fail to see the world clearly, and therefore, if we can only see the world more clearly, we will become happier, suffer less, we will become better people and treat other people better. That's an amazing claim when you think about it, but I actually think it's defensible. And in any event, my point is that at the very core of enlightenment, in the Buddhist sense, is just the idea, in a certain sense, of simple clarity. Now, Buddhists consider this very hard to attain perfect clarity because they think that, we are shrouded in a world of delusion, that humans by their nature are subject to distortions of perception and thought that really give them a warped view of reality. And by the way, I think modern psychology is bearing this out, and that's one thing that I emphasize in my book, but in any event, the object of the game is to see the world clearly. If you read the Satipatthana Sutta, I think you'll see how it really does amount to very kind of systematic guidance in how to see things clearly. Your feelings, your physical sensations, your thoughts, sights, sounds, everything. How to attain clarity. I think it's even fair to say that part of the goal is to see things as objectively as possible. Again, that sounds prosaic, I know, but I think that's a big part of the goal. Now, at this point, different Buddhist thinkers might, start quibbling about language and so on, because, for example, some really very serious Buddhist thinkers are comfortable saying, when you take a mindful view of your feelings, it's a more detached view, whereas others would say, I don't want to say detached, I want to say non-attached. So there are all kinds of issues all kinds of controversies you can get yourself into if you start using any of these words. But I do think objectivity is really a big part of the idea. At the same time, I understand why people are careful about the language, because there is an irony here, which is that the way you get a more objective view of your feelings, for example, is through a deep experiential immersion in them, okay? You kind of get more into your feelings, and that gives you the more objective perspective, a more kind of critical perspective. So you take something like anxiety. You know, the normal human reaction to anxiety is to try to push it away. Think something that'll make it go away. Talk to somebody who will say something that'll make it go away. Eat something that will distract you. The mindful approach is to just really accept the feeling and experience it. And yet, by doing that, you know, you can come to have a kind of distance from it. I have, at times, after meditating, gotten to a point where, you know, I was having anxiety, and I really, it just seemed like it was a piece of abstract sculpture I was looking at. You know, I was noticing where it was in my body and so on, and I was indifferent to it. I mean, I wish I could say that I can always manage that when I'm feeling anxiety. I can't, but it's happened, and that's an example of the irony of how mindfulness, how accepting things, not running away from things, getting up close to them can give you ultimately kind of critical distance from them. And a couple of things can happen once you have this distance. First of all, you start realizing the extent to which feelings influence, and I would say often distort, your perceptions and thoughts, okay? And second, it gives you the option of not going with them, not accepting the guidance of these feelings. And I'm talking about all kinds of feelings here, you know, hatred, contempt, rage, and so on. And so maybe you can see how mindfulness could be valuable, and maybe you're starting to see some connection between this and mindful resistance. I'll try to make that clearer as we go along. So, you know, we're clearly not talking about a kind of numbness to things. We're talking kind of an acute awareness. One person who drives this home is Thomas Williams Rhys Davids. If you're wondering why we should care what he says about mindfulness, well, he's the person who actually chose to translate the word sati as mindfulness, like a century or more ago. He was one of the first prolific translators of Buddhist texts. And he's the one who made the choice of the word mindfulness. Here's how he characterizes the Buddhist ideal of right mindfulness. And by the way, right mindfulness is one of the 8 factors in the famous Noble Eightfold Path, just to give you some sense of how important mindfulness is in Buddhist teaching. And he characterizes right mindfulness as an active, watchful mind. Okay, it's that simple. It's that prosaic. I don't mean that's all there is to it, but that's what he highlights as kind of the essence of mindfulness. And, you know, if you just look in the dictionary at the plain English meaning of mindfulness or mindful, you'll see things like in the Random House Dictionary, attentive, aware, careful, you know, very much on the same wavelength as Rhys Davids, not coincidentally, because, of course, he had the everyday meaning of mindful in mind when he chose it as the translation of sati. And I think that it was a good translation. So, clear, attentive, alert, watchful, careful. Obviously, these would be assets in a lot of endeavors, right? To kind of drive home how valuable they are in mindful resistance, I need to take a little bit of a detour and talk about tribalism. So you probably heard the word tribalism a lot lately. It's come in vogue. We are said to be living in very tribalistic times. America is tribalistic. We suffer from the psychology of tribalism. I think in some ways, tribalistic, it's a very unsatisfactory word. I think in some ways it's misleading. And when we get to questions and answers, if people want to talk about that or anything else, feel free. Also, some people find it offensive for reasons I understand. But it has become the term of art to refer to this tendency to associate so strongly with a group that you have antipathy toward another group, and that your kind of thoughts and perceptions are actually warped by your affiliation with this group. I think it is a big problem. And I also think Donald Trump is just about, in this sense of the word tribalistic, the most tribalistic person like ever. Everything is about us and them for Trump. He is a master at manipulating the psychology of tribalism. I don't think we've ever had a president whose political strategy was so organized around getting his supporters to hate the other team. Now, I think mindfulness can be an antidote to the psychology of tribalism and to the phenomenon of tribalism. Now, by that, I don't just mean that if we got everyone in the world to meditate more, there would be less tribalism. I think that's true. It's a good long-term goal. But I think right now, we're not going to get everyone to meditate. For example, I don't see Trump himself anytime soon heading off on a 10-day meditation retreat. You know, it's an interesting thing to think about and possibly base a situation comedy on, but I just don't really think it's in the cards. So the question becomes, can mindfulness in the short term be an actual effective weapon in combating tribalism? And I think it can. And I think it's one of the best weapons that we can deploy right now. And let me give you a kind of specific example. So one of Trump's favorite tactics for getting his team to hate the other team is to depict people on the other side as hating his supporters, having contempt for his supporters. Like a common theme is like, it's a bunch of kind of cosmopolitan coastal elites who dismiss his followers as dumb, crude, xenophobic, racist, and so on. That's the way he wants his opponents to be depicted, as having that kind of contempt for his followers. And I think all too often people, including some people in the resistance, oblige him by driving home that idea. There's a kind of classic example I cite sometimes, partly because of the prominence of the person. This is a tweet from John Lovett, who was an Obama speechwriter, co-host of the very resistance-y podcast, Pod Save America. About a year after Trump was elected, he tweeted, "The president is a terrible person, surrounded by terrible people, stoking the terrible instincts of terrible followers for terrible purposes." So I would call that a negative evaluation on balance. And I would direct your attention to the phrase terrible followers. Okay, now, if you challenged Lovett, he might say, well, I didn't mean all his followers. But of course, if you are a Trump follower and you see that tweet, you're going to think he's talking about you, right? You're going to think Trump is exactly right. These people hold us in contempt. And there's a good chance you will see the tweet, because it was retweeted 7,000 times and it got 34,000 likes. And unfortunately, things of this nature do tend to go viral, kind of via the psychology of tribalism as it plays out on kind of our side, so to speak, the anti-Trump side. So, pretty glaring example, I would say, of contempt for Trump's followers. I think there are a lot of subtler examples that you see on social media, sometimes in news reports. And so I would submit that if you avoid sharing this kind of stuff, avoid retweeting, avoid liking, avoid sharing on Facebook, things that are in this spirit, you've done the world a service, because you've in some sense denied Donald Trump this source of strength. And this would be something you'd want to do as part of mindful resistance. And if you ask, well, how do I avoid retweeting things like this? I think mindfulness can really help, but precisely because it makes you more aware of how feelings are guiding your behavior, right? Of how what caused you to retweet that John Lovett tweet, I would suggest in many cases, was actual hatred of somebody, hatred of Trump, hatred of the followers, certainly deep antagonism toward them, contempt. I mean, that's what drove the retweet. And if you practice a lot of mindfulness meditation, I think you're more likely to be able to pause before retweeting and really examine what's going on in your mind. And first of all, recognize that what is driving what seems like a decision, we think of ourselves as like deciding to retweet, but I think you'll see that what's really driving our decisions very often is a feeling. And again, you'll have the option of not pursuing the feeling. So, my general guidance for using social media is to, try to be mindful of the feeling before you retweet or share anything. try to become aware of the feeling that may be encouraging you to do that, and ask yourself: is this a feeling that is generally a good guide to conduct? And if the answer is that it's a feeling that's not always a good guide to conduct, then just stop and ask yourself, well, then what are the consequences of retweeting this or sharing this? Or saying this, if you're just talking to somebody, right? Or emailing this or anything else. This is a very... the word consequences suggests that I'm giving you very kind of pragmatic, tactical advice here, right? I'm not saying hatred and contempt are bad. I do think they're bad. It's just not what I'm saying right now. Right now, I'm just saying that they are not effective and that they are often counterproductive. It's a very, very pragmatic advice. Now, you find this kind of pragmatic advice in both Christian scripture and Buddhist scripture, okay? So, for example, one thing the Buddha is famous for saying is, hatreds never cease through hatred in this world. That's not a statement about whether hatred is moral, immoral, or immoral. It's just an observation about whether it works in putting an end to the hatred on the other side. The observation is that it doesn't. The longer version of that, by the way, is the full version of that is often rendered as hatreds never cease through hatred in this world. Through love alone they cease. But actually, that's a loose translation at best. A more literal translation would be, through non-hatred alone, they cease. So that just drives home how pragmatic this is. This is just all a statement about how hatred is ineffective, even counterproductive. A case of comparably pragmatic assessment in Christian scripture, you've probably heard, this is in Paul's letter to the Romans, this phrase, if your enemy is hungry, feed him. If he is thirsty, give him something to drink. You may not have heard the rest of the verse. And by the way, this is actually taken from the Old Testament. Paul is quoting scripture himself here. But the full version is, if your enemy is hungry, feed him. If he is thirsty, give him something to drink. In doing this, you will heap burning coals on his head. Okay? So that's my kind of love. Scholars differ as to exactly what he meant, but I think it is safe to characterize this as tactical advice, right? Now, in both Christian and Buddhist texts, you also do see the assertion that, characterizations of hatred that are more purely moral in nature. So, for example, in Christianity, there is the assertion that love is a good in and of itself. It just does align with moral truth. Let me read something you've probably heard. Jesus said, you've heard that it was said, love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, that you may be children of your Father in heaven. He causes his sun to rise on the evil and the good and sends rain on the righteous and the unrighteous. Then the culmination is he says, be perfect, therefore, as your heavenly Father is perfect. So there he's saying that God himself, the ultimate manifestation of moral truth, does manifest universal love. So that's a statement that love is a morally compelled virtue. It's not just practically valuable. Similarly, in Buddhism, the rationale for giving compassion to all people, and in fact all sentient beings, is not merely pragmatic. It's also an assertion of moral truth, and there are actual arguments, philosophical arguments as to why this is the case, and to just quickly characterize a core argument for why compassion is always in order. The idea is that if you stripped away all of the perceptual and cognitive distortions that we by nature are prone to, in other words, if you attained full enlightenment, you would have stripped away everything that stands in the way of compassion, okay? Because so many of these distortions and out-and-out delusions are about the self. They are selfish in their nature. If you get rid of all of them, you will care as much about the well-being of other humans as you were inclined to care about your own well-being. There's another kind of Buddhist idea, that another kind of Buddhist reason to show compassion to people that you're actually inclined to hate because they do these horrible things. And it's kind of a there but for the grace of God go I argument. The idea, if you put it in modern terminology, it's kind of an acknowledgement that, well, I guess if I had been born in his shoes, with his genes and his environment, I guess maybe I'd have wound up like him. Okay? If you want a challenging example of applying this, try doing this with Trump, right? Okay, so if you'd been born with his genes, and as he's pointed out, they are very good genes, but anyway, if you'd been born with his genes and his environment, and by the way, his father seems to have been no prince, I wouldn't have wanted him as my father. The idea is you would be Trump, okay? So that would be another kind of Buddhist reason to show compassion for Trump. That isn't to say you approve of anything he's done, and that isn't to say that you don't hold him accountable for it, but you don't gratuitously wish him ill. That's the Buddhist view, I think. Now, there's a second, to get back to that John Lovett tweet, and why it does not, would not meet with the approval of mindful resistance, or even the approval of Buddhist philosophy. Let me go a little deeper into Buddhism and say that a totally clear view of the world, the kind that you would have upon attaining enlightenment, involves a number of specific things that are talked about in Buddhist texts. One of them is what's called emptiness, okay? The enlightened person sees emptiness in everything. I know that doesn't sound very inspiring, doesn't sound like the thing, that you'd want. You don't generally find people rejoicing in the emptiness of it all. But emptiness in a Buddhist context means something a little different from what you may be expecting, okay? It basically means that things don't have essence, that we are inclined to attribute essence to things, and they don't really have them. Let me give you an example from it's actually my first meditation retreat, a kind of a very dramatic, to me at least, experience I had. I was taking a walk, and I saw a kind of weed called the plantain weed that I had actually spent a lot of time trying to kill because it had infested a couple of my lawns. And I just looked at it, and I thought, I can't believe I've been trying to kill this thing because it is just as beautiful as everything else in the forest. And I really felt that deeply, right? So this sounds like in a certain sense, a trivial observation. Obviously, weed is just a human culturally imposed category. It's not like it says weed in the DNA. Some cultures call some things weed, some don't. That's true, but what the experience showed me is that without even thinking about it, we normally go around attributing essence to things, and you really notice it when it's gone, and it really changes your view of the world. Now, seeing essence of weed in a weed is not a grave moral transgression, but when we apply essence to humans and groups of humans, the moral stakes get higher, right? Like when you see essence of enemy in someone, the way that shapes the way you behave toward them, and also when you see essences in groups, right? In fact, you've probably heard, I think rightly, people say that stereotyping an ethnic group, for example, is an example of essentialism, and it's wrong to be essentialist. Well, Buddhism certainly agrees in principle that it's wrong to be essentialist, because when we carry the sense of essence into the realm of human affairs, it can be a very dangerous and damaging thing. And this gets back to one reason I would not retweet that John Lovett tweet, is because any suggestion that all of Trump's followers are anything at all, racist, stupid, whatever, is a case of essentialism. And I also think it's factually wrong in a way that impedes our understanding of what supports Trump and Trumpism and how we need to grapple with the problem in the long term. Now, at this point, I need to make a confession. This is going to shock some of you. It shocked me, I found out. 3 of my 4 siblings voted for Trump. So the actual murmurs, did you hear the murmurs of disbelief? Yes, there are real people who voted for Trump. And some of them are related to me. And one thing I noticed in what little conversation I've had with them about it, and I mean, having conversations just too painful for me to do a lot of it, but they're motivated by different things. For one of them, it's all about abortion. She doesn't especially like Trump, but anybody who will get Roe versus Wade overturned. For another of them, the idea was, quote, I wanted to throw a wrench into the political works and so on. And I do think that just a lot of different things motivate Trump supporters, and it behooves us to try to understand these things. Some of them are racist. For some of them, there are economic grievances. And sometimes the two get intertwined. Sometimes it's the economic situation of someone that leads them to start developing a racist attitude toward a group. In any event, I want to understand it. I want to understand what gives rise to racism. This, of course, doesn't mean that you accept the racism, doesn't mean you don't hold the people accountable. But I think it's an important thing. So, okay, I'm not far from done, and we can open it up then. In general, as you may have gathered, there is a lot of emphasis in Buddhism on dealing with things skillfully, right? Just assessing the situation, not getting too hung up on, who's to blame, who should feel guilty, and so on, just solving the problem. If that involves punishing people, you punish them, but you don't do it out of spite, vengeance, out of a retributive impulse. You just solve the problem, you deal with it skillfully. And I like to think that's very much the spirit of mindful resistance. I want to say a couple of other just quick, maybe reassuring things. You do not, in order to participate in mindful resistance, have to attain enlightenment, okay? I don't know anyone who has. I prove every day that I haven't. Still, I do think it's useful to keep enlightenment in mind, not so much as an end state, but as a process. Try to see the world a little more clearly. Work at it. You'll suffer setbacks, but try to do it. Second thing is, you don't have to meditate to do this. There are other ways to clarify your view of the world, other spiritual traditions. There are therapeutic things that can help you see the world more clearly, attain some measure of equanimity in the process of doing it. Now, that said, I'm an advocate of meditation. I think it's a good way to become better at doing all this stuff. And I think one reason I'm a fan of it is because the relationship between our feelings and our thoughts and our perceptions is so subtle. The influence feelings exert on us, and often the distorting influence they exert on us, is so subtle that it's really a challenge to be aware of this on a day-to-day basis. I find that the more I meditate, the more often I am aware of it, and the more often I can avoid being guided by unfortunate impulses. And I also think, meditation can help fulfill the promise I made at the outset, that mindfulness can help you as well as the world. I think if you meditate regularly, you'll probably do just fewer regrettable things, fewer regrettable emails, less yelling at the kids, less road rage, less pointless fulminating. Whatever it is that's making you unhappy, I think you'll probably do less of it. And as for the helping the world part, of the promise that you can help yourself and help the world at the same time. I hope it's clear by now that I think a kind of equanimous and very clear frame of mind can help us try to meet the challenge of dealing with Trump and Trumpism, both in the short run, both as a short-run political challenge and as a long-term, very deep and complex problem. Okay, I have to just quickly insert a kind of obsessive sermon of mine. It's quick. I just want to say, so in my book Nonzero, it's kind of a history of the world, and one thing I say in that is that, if you look at where we were tens of thousands of years ago, we have slowly climbed to being on the verge of a true global community, right? But we really haven't sealed the deal. Still a lot of conflict and infighting, and the psychology of tribalism, as it's called, does play a big role, and it's a big problem. And it would be nice for us to seal the deal and become a true global community, not just because it's nice to be free of the fighting and the ill will, but also because the fighting and the ill will stand in the way of solving really grave and serious global problems. I mean, you hear a lot about climate change. That's a good example. But there's a lot that you don't hear so much about, including things like the proliferation of various kinds of weapons of mass destruction, some of which are being developed only now. I could go on all day about problems that I think aren't getting much attention, that pose actually existential threats to the world, and that can only be dealt with via global governance in some sense of the word, and we will not be able to do global governance if we don't get the fighting and the conflict and the hatred under control. So, I would say it's not too dramatic to say that we're not just talking about, when we address the set of problems we've been discussing, it's not too dramatic to say we're not talking just about helping the world, but maybe about actually saving the world. And speaking of saving, one word that you hear in Christianity that you don't hear so much in Buddhism is salvation. Okay? Now, I think in Christianity, a word that dramatic is used not just in a reflection of how dramatic the promise is, right? Like everlasting life, deliverance from eternal damnation. That's pretty dramatic. That's a salvation I'd like to have. But I think there's also a recognition in the drama of the word of how kind of heavy the burden of sin is from which you are being liberated by God's forgiveness. I think that's very much built into the notion of salvation as well, because the idea is in Christianity we are all fallen. A very common version of this is original sin. We're born with this burden of sin. We're really a long way from being great people, and we're lucky to be forgiven. Well, there's a version of original sin in Buddhism. There is the idea, or something like original sin. There's the idea that we are born kind of confused, born with an unclear view of the world, born with ignorance, born with delusion. And the idea is very much as in Christianity, that it's a really big-time problem. It's like major delusion. So, when Jesus says in the New Testament, this is something I think, kind of resonates with Buddhism. When Jesus says, "Oh, hypocrite, why are you so obsessed with the speck in your brother's eye when you've got like a log in your eye?" Well, in Buddhism, the idea is very much that we all kind of have a log in our eye, at least, at birth. We can work on lessening the problem, but it is that serious a problem. It is true delusion. And that's why enlightenment, even appreciable measures of enlightenment, take so much work. So, before we go to Q&A, I would just say, it's easy to, if I've been at all persuasive, then maybe you'll leave this tonight thinking, well, maybe I should try meditation, or maybe I should meditate a little more. And maybe it'll help me a little, and maybe it'll help the world. I would encourage you to maybe try thinking actually a little more dramatically, and think that maybe the world needs not just helping, but actual saving. That's really where we are. We're at a point of existential crisis. And that maybe we are all, by our nature, so prone to delusion that it's not too dramatic to talk about working toward our own salvation. In which case, if you accept those premises, I would just amp up what I said at the beginning of the talk, and rather than say you can help the world by helping yourself, I would say you can help save the world by working toward your own salvation. Now, if that is too melodramatic for you, I have an alternative ending. the Buddha is famously said to have said that, his last words are said to have been to his helpers, work toward your own salvation. As it turns out, that's a very loose translation. The text is actually better translated as strive on diligently. Okay, so I would just, in closing, encourage you to strive on diligently. Try your best to see the world more clearly, and I think you'll be glad you did. So, thank you. Now, we do have time for Q&A, and I also want to make one little public service announcement. As people who are regular readers of the newsletter know, subscribers of the newsletter know, there's going to be an actual meetup after this of regular readers of the newsletter. I gave, in the most recent issue, faulty guidance as to who the person is who will guide you to the room where there will be the meetup. The actual person is standing back there and is raising his hand. That's Mark. He's waving it vigorously. So follow him after I answer questions. If there are questions, are there questions or comments? Yes, sir.
Yes, okay, thank you, Bob. Yeah, I just wanted to ask about the efficacy of dealing with someone like Trump or other authoritarian leaders. The world now has a large group of authoritarian leaders all over, from Duterte to Bolsonaro to Maduro to, there's more than 7 psychopaths there, I think. But don't you need a strong, forceful approach to combating these sort of psychopathic alpha males as opposed to simply being mindful and watching them?
So you don't think me sitting here meditating alone will make Trump go away? No, it's a good question. I mean, yeah, there's a time and a place for force. I mean, I'd say 2 things. First of all, the fact that there are these people around the world, these kind of right-wing authoritarians, suggests that there's something deeper and broader going on here that we really need to understand. Okay, there's that. As for dealing with them forcefully, yeah, I think sometimes you need to stand up. Now, one theme in the newsletter, one thing I've said a couple of times in the newsletter over the last year or so is that I wouldn't get too obsessed with this Russiagate thing. We don't know, we haven't seen a smoking gun yet. We don't know what the Mueller report will find, but it will find something, and then we will deal with it appropriately. And in the meanwhile, I said, there's the danger that if we are all not just obsessed with the news about it, but so many of us kind of continue saying, aha, there's the smoking gun. This guy's going to jail, impeachment, so on. If we do too much of that, it's going to raise expectations. And then if the Mueller report doesn't find the smoking gun, that's going to allow Trump to declare victory, which I would say has more or less happened. I mean, I remain agnostic. I'm not saying, I think there may well be more wrongdoing than Mueller was able to uncover. But this is one thing I said, but I also said, now, if William Barr refuses to turn over the Mueller report, make public the report, because he had that, he could have done that. He had that discretion. He didn't have to turn over even a redacted version of the report. I said, then we should hit the streets. I mean, I'll see you there. That is time to protest, even though nothing illegal really would have been done. Barr has the statutory authority to withhold the report, but there are times when you actually have to do mass mobilization and demonstration. I just want to be, clear and careful about what the things are, and also just kind of when you make a big deal of something. Make sure it's worth making a big deal of. So, for example, Trump keeps violating norms. And when he violates a new one that's never been violated before, I think you really need to draw attention to it. Okay, so, for example, he designated the Iranian Revolutionary Guard a terrorist organization. No government entity, military or otherwise, had ever before been designated a terrorist organization. That has huge consequences. Instagram took the people in the Revolutionary Guard off of Instagram. It has, and I think it makes conflict more likely. I think it's worth pointing that out. That was something new. As for, another norm he's broken, like just the idea of like doing these junior high taunts toward all your political opponents, well, I mean, it is what it is, right? It was worth pointing out when it started because it's really genuinely unfortunate. But I'd say spend your time on the important stuff. And, when it's time to demonstrate, even commit civil disobedience, break the law, it's time to do it. But be clear about it. And what the grounds for it are. Yeah. Wait, Mike's coming.
Hi, thank you for your words. Very helpful. I'm sort of able to deal, this is a personal thing, with Trump. I turn down the sound when he comes on the television, et cetera, et cetera. But personally, I feel sick to my stomach when I think about or see Mitch McConnell and what's his name with the mustache who wants to go to war. I actually feel ill, especially Mitch McConnell, because in his very quiet, obstinate way, he's preventing our democracy from functioning. And I don't know, I mean, I can sign petitions and go to demonstrations and do all that, but personally, I actually feel ill. Sometimes I wake up and I start to feel ill thinking about it.
Yeah, no, I identify with that. I mean, if you can't feel ill about John Bolton, who can you feel ill about, And I was just thinking the other day, like, what if Trump gets reelected? And I just had this, it's just a sick feeling in my stomach. I just don't think I could go on. I mean, I would have to, move to another country, do something brazenly illegal. I don't know. It just seems unbearable. As for Trump himself, I've gotten a little better at just seeing him as an almost comic figure. I mean, he is pathetic, but it's difficult. I mean, I would say, look, if the question is, how do you overcome that? If you're agreeing that, that's not productive in and of itself, because, for example, it may just drive you away from the news. I don't want that. I want people to focus on the news that's worth focusing on. I don't want people to move to an island or just stay completely off of media and social media forever, because then they're probably not going to be able to be engaged citizens. So if the question is how to get over that, I hate to sound like a stereotype of a proponent of mindfulness meditation, but it actually can help with those kinds of things. Or just out of curiosity, are you a meditator at all? Occasionally. Meditation didn't come naturally to me. What sold me on it was actually going to a week-long silent meditation retreat. That's what it took for me. And then I understood its power. But even after getting back from the retreat, it takes work, to keep yourself doing it every day. And even then, the results aren't as dramatic as they might seem on the retreat. But I will say, if you have a regular mindfulness meditation practice, and especially if you've been on a retreat and so kind of seen it work at a deep level, the kind of level you can see it work at if you're really off the grid for a week and meditating with discipline every day, then I think you'll at least understand how meditation can help with problems like this. The basic idea is you sit, you don't run away from it. It's not like, I can't stand to think of Bolton. You actually, believe it or not, sit down, close your eyes, and try to think of Bolton. Not appetizing, but the idea is you don't run away from the feeling, you observe it, and you just get a little better at, when you feel it coming on, it's like, okay, and then it kind of fades away. That's the way mindfulness of emotional reactions works. So if you haven't tried a meditation retreat, I recommend them. Almost everyone I've recommended go to one has been a satisfied customer. But and there are other ways to get more deeply into meditation. There are meditation apps and so on. But I do think it takes real work, regular meditation every day for some appreciable period of time.
So I want to provide an example where it looked to me like anger and disgust was sort of an effective reaction to an event coming from the Trump administration. So I'm an immigration attorney, and about a year ago, Trump became famous for his baby cages, putting children in cages, separating children from their parents. And that policy, that explicit policy, has largely been stopped going forward. I mean, they did not continue with that policy. And a lot of it was the incredible work of some really great attorneys who did legal work to stop it, some people on the ground observing, reporting it, and that was thoughtful, careful work. Mm-hmm. But a lot of why it stopped was because of a sort of a visceral disgust, horror, anger that the American public displayed. And in fact, I've read recently he had thought about opening up Guantanamo for children, immigrant children, and the resistance in his own administration and his own reticence to do it ultimately is he does not want to be reviled in this way, and officials around him did not want to be reviled in this way. So that seems to me a situation where anger has been effective.
Righteous anger has driven a lot of productive things. And, when people are following righteous anger in a way that I think is productive, I don't try to get in their way. I would just encourage people to evaluate their motivation and ask themselves, is this the most productive direction to go in? Is this where all our attention should be focused? I think, in a way, immigration, even within the issue of immigration, there's a question, well, what should you focus on? And I think, for example, that the wall has become almost a bigger thing than it deserves to be in a certain sense, which is to say, it makes me sick, the idea, because of what it symbolizes. But from the point of view of Trump's, I don't want to see it happen. But there's been so much attention on it. In other words, tight border control of the kind that the wall would represent is not the cruelest aspect of his immigration policy. A thing that really sickens me is how we've changed the rules under which all the immigrants who are already in the country live. Okay, for years and years, we said, okay, it's fine if you come here. Yeah, technically it's against the law, but look, you line up in front of Home Depot every day. Cops know it. They don't do anything. You get picked up. You go do some work. It's fine. For years and years and years, we did this. And now, and these people are, productive workers and by and large good neighbors. And now all of a sudden, Trump changes the rules in a way that leaves many of them to live in terror, right? And I think, for my money, if you have to ask yourself, how do you allocate your attention? I think that almost hasn't gotten enough attention. And all I'm saying is that it's easy for certain things to acquire huge symbolic importance, even if maybe they're not where the gravest actual short-term crisis is. And I admit, by the way, not only do I applaud, righteous anger that is channeled in ways I consider productive, but I admit that it is a little bit of a challenge to kind of strike the balance. In other words, maintain a mindfulness that allows you to have what I would consider a kind of judicious distance from things in a certain sense, and realize, well, maybe, fulminating over the Mueller report a year before it's going to come out is not the best use of my time. Maybe I should do something else. It's a difficult balance on the one hand, do that, and yet remain engaged, and yet continue to care. There is such a thing as I wouldn't say it's true mindfulness when you're doing it, but there is such a thing as becoming too removed, too emotionally distant, and that's a challenge. No. I'll let you choose, Ben.
Thank you very much for your talk. I had a question about the statement you made that the way to combat hatred is by non-hatred and not love as much. I'd love for you to elaborate a little on that perspective. And also I was wondering, what are some of the ways by which one can mindfully resist Trump besides not resharing his tweets and meditating every day? Thank you.
Okay. Well, the two things are kind of related. I would say, first of all, I didn't personally say that love is not a way to conquer hatred. My point is just that the actual correct translation of that one thing the Buddha said is not that love will conquer hatred. It's that non-hatred is a good weapon against hatred. Precisely because it just feeds the fire. It's a recognition that it does feed the fire. And as for what various kinds of things can be part of mindful resistance, I would say, first of all, because feeding the fire is bad, I wouldn't underestimate the importance of just not feeding the fire. I mean, it's epidemic on social media. Unless your Twitter feed is very different from mine or your Facebook or whatever, it's still going on. I mean, people are, because the way the dynamic works, the way the psychology of tribalism works, is the way to gain stature in your own tribe, your own ideological tribe, is to evince maximum hostility toward the other tribe. So all the worst behaviors get the most reinforcement. And I just want to, it's a little bit of a hobby horse of mine, and a little bit of a tangent, but I want to talk about what I consider a particularly pernicious example of people using this dynamic, the psychology of tribalism, to elevate their stature within the tribe. I don't know how many of you follow foreign affairs very closely. For me, it's kind of a hobby horse. And one thing that's happened is a number of people, including neoconservatives, but hawks, who played a big role in getting us into the Iraq War and various other foreign policy adventures, have joined the resistance, okay, and have been very adept. I'll mention one name, Bill Kristol. Become very adept at tweeting things that get them more and more followers. I mean, his Twitter clout has grown massively. And I guarantee you that he's not sitting there right now saying, hey, whoa on Iran, right? Easy on Iran. No, he's going to, now that he's got all this stature within the resistance, he's going to use it in ways that I think those of us who are skeptical of American military intervention are going to find very unfortunate. Okay, and so to me, it is a successful exercise of mindful resistance if you get enough detachment from the process to go, wait a second, like that tweet that came from Bill Kristol, that was very appetizing, but do we really want to strengthen him? I mean, that actually is important, and to be aware, a lot of what I'm interested in is us becoming aware of the dynamics of the psychology of tribalism. So, for example, as soon as kind of Russiagate started, and we started associating Trump with Russia, and in some ways it's a valid association. There was some kind of stuff going on there. But still, the way the psychology of tribalism works is, well, if Trump is bad, and he's Russia's friend, then Russia is bad. Now, Russia does bad things, Putin's no prince, and so on, but what this has done is move a lot of kind of liberals in the resistance toward much more of a Cold War mindset toward Russia. Again, much more of a mindset that a Bill Kristol of the world approves, right? So, I'm just... look, the challenge of resisting Trump in the short term is a very... it's a very challenging one. I guess that's why we call it a challenge. And I don't have a lot of simple cures. I mean, there are, I would say, spend your time looking at, what organizations are are really doing things out there. I mean, a kind of a militant anti-war organization is Code Pink, for example. But I would mainly say just try to be aware of how the psychology of tribalism is working in America, in your own mind, and do something about it and talk about it, And here's another thing that maybe isn't exactly what you had in mind, but, if part of the problem is that people on the other side think we hold them in contempt and think they're stupid and think we hate them, you might try, it's not easy, but try actual civil engagement with them on social media, polite, civil, respectful engagement. That's very hard. It can't hurt, and I really think it can help, because the less they think we hate them, the better.
Thank you for everything you do, your books. This is great talk. Could you comment on a strategy that I sort of use that I think helps me maintain some equilibrium, which is sort of feeling that the medium is the message and that social media doesn't work, cable news doesn't work, so I just don't get information from them. I try to limit my information to more responsible, maybe traditional media outlets, New York Times, Washington Post, Boston Globe, and the Mindfulness Resistance newsletter.
God bless you, my son. You have attained salvation. I would say, even honestly, even the New York Times and the Washington Post have, to some extent, I would say, joined the resistance. And the New York Times' coverage of international affairs is often lacking. There's a tendency for them to, there was a headline just the other day, basically like Kim Jong-un and Supreme Leader of Iran and Maduro in Venezuela they're like beating Trump, right? And it was just kind of like throwing it in Trump's face. It's like, do something, It was just kind of an incendiary piece. It was a somewhat sensationalized piece. But in general, I would say, that's just a peripheral comment. It's hard to find media that I would heartily recommend, with the possible exception of the Mindful Resistance newsletter.
Hi, thank you also for making the news something that I can understand each week, and without having to read everything. There's so much coming at you. But you include each week, and as you said, if Trump is elected again, I don't think I could handle it. As somebody who wasn't politically engaged before 2 years ago, I just feel like I've spent a ton of time on it. And part of that has been through all these new groups that have come up, which are Red to Blue, Indivisible, all these groups that are engaging to get people out to vote, which is sort of a team thing, taking sides or whatever. But I feel like that, for me, has been something that saved me. And you have in your newsletter each week news you can use, which sometimes helps, move things forward. But how do you feel about those ways of engagement? Because those are the things that have saved me the last couple of years. And I feel like we need to figure out a way, mindfully resisting, like to get more people engaged now, because we can't do it all at the last second. It has to be for the next 2 years. That's how we did the midterms, and we have to keep moving on that. So how does that relate? The news you can use or ways to resist. And there are a lot of them, right, which if people who are feeling, like they can't watch Bolton on TV or whatever, there's things you can do every single day that are helping get the vote out, which is what we have to do to win. But how does that relate to mindfully resisting?
Well, first of all, thanks for those positive comments about the newsletter, Sarah. They'd be a little more meaningful if they hadn't come from my sister-in-law, but they did. And I should say, this is a time for you to do your little thing, right? What's the name of Sarah is incredibly active in voter mobilization. What is the postcards? Who's the postcards guy? She has brought cards that she will hand out. But no, that's a perfect example of a kind of online engagement that's very productive. Getting the vote out, figuring out where we need the vote to be out, and doing things like that. And I have to admit, I'm not an expert in this kind of stuff. I'm not like an activist by nature. And to be honest, I think the newsletter could do a better job of drawing people toward things that they can do. I think we've kind of fallen down on that. It partly reflects my own background and my own, the fact that I have not been as much of an activist as I should be. But, that's exactly right. That's a very, there is always the danger of what's called slacktivism, right? You sign some petition and something, and it's the last you see of it. But the kind of thing you're talking about that actually gets voters out is a very constructive thing. And it's called what again? Postcards? Well, no, but I'm not against. No, and no, I mean, obviously, I'm opposed to Trump. Now, strictly speaking, Mindful Resistance is not a partisan newsletter. It's a newsletter that's concerned about, for one thing, the broader forces that gave rise to Trump and doing something about them. Now, most of the people who are sympathetic to that cause are probably going to be Democrats, but there certainly are Republicans, and the Republicans who read the newsletter. And no, I mean, political, good old-fashioned politics is fun. There's all kinds of things that are in some sense or another technically tribal. You're affiliated with an ideological tribe, you're a Boston Red Sox fan, whatever, that aren't bad. What's bad is when, your allegiance to your tribe entails hostility toward another tribe. By its very nature, the coherence of your tribe depends on hostility toward another tribe. Or when it just warps your vision and leads you to spend time unproductively or counterproductively and fan the flames and increase the amount of hatred in the world. So it isn't tribal affiliation that's bad, and I'm certainly not against partisan affiliation, no. I'm wondering how much longer I should go. What has Ben, you have a sense. Ben was that the get off the stage motion that I saw there? That was so why don't we, if there's, is there one more question?
Hi, thank you so much for speaking tonight, and I will put in a big plug for Indivisible and Postcards to Voters and things like that. It's saving my sanity. And here's my question for you. The Trump folks at the rallies, when you see, MAGA hats and whatnot, and that's one thing, right? And kind of hating that tribe. I get that is just not productive, right? It's kind of sinking into the negative, right? Here's the struggle for me in this is people that are close to me. And there are people that are close to me in my life, and I heard you say that with your siblings, right? People that I genuinely care about, a couple people that I work with who voted for Trump, and I don't think they're they're not, no one said, I'm so sorry, what a mistake. And that is eating my soul.
Yeah, but, first of all, identify with that. My strategy has been to avoid talking about it to my siblings. We actually had a family reunion almost 2 years ago, and there were about, 35, 40 people there. Most of them had voted for Trump or supported Trump. And for the entire 5 days, the word Trump did not come up, because we all knew that if that word was mentioned, there would be blood. It would get bad. Not real blood, but it would get bad. So and I'm not proud of this, but sometimes the best thing to do is just not mention it. But that said, when you say they haven't said I'm sorry, they haven't said it was a mistake, I contend that people are more likely to change their mind, say, maybe it was a mistake, if there aren't a bunch of people yelling at them about how manifestly stupid they are. The more hostility you get from the other tribe, the stronger your allegiance to your tribe, and the stronger your allegiance to Trump. So, I know that a certain amount of what I'm recommending doesn't sound like actual activism. To refrain from doing various things. Refrain from feeding the fire. But I would say two things. First of all, you can go activist and try the civil engagement and just non-judgmentally discuss things with them. Very polite, say, well, I can see how, from your point of view, yeah, this was a problem, and Trump has ideas about how to solve it. My view is this. If only the civil engagement itself, it isn't that will change their mind, but I think the more people they encounter on the other side who engage them respectfully, the less defensively they will continue to cling, the less fiercely they will cling to their tribe, to Trump. Look, it's a big problem, and it takes a lot of people doing a lot of little things. That's the challenge. And it's just a challenge we all face in everything, is that you go out and you try to do things that you think will help the world. You're very rarely lucky enough to see that, to see the big fruits, to see that, well, this was the thing that made the difference. But at the same time, the fact is that if enough people are out there doing these little things, the difference may be made, even if you can never be sure that something you did is what made the difference. So, thank you all for coming, and be mindful.